All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the absolutely massive financial stakes of real estate. Think about it. Whether it's a huge bank trying to secure a mortgage, a government agency acquiring land, or just a family making literally the biggest purchase of their entire lives, every single one of them relies on one fundamental thing: a trustworthy valuation. But that actually brings up a really crucial paradox that we're going to unpack today. Why exactly is property value considered a professional opinion, rather than just a concrete mathematical fact? We've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover, so we're going to structure this into four distinct phases today: the true meaning of appraisal, appraisers versus other professionals, the art and science of the practice, and finally, navigating ethical pressures. So let's kick things off with Section 1, the true meaning of appraisal. Now, when most people hear the word appraisal, they kind of just assume it's a simple math problem, right? Like you just multiply the land area by whatever the going price per square meter is, and boom, you're done. Well, actually, that's completely wrong. An appraisal requires a highly specific, rigorous equation. It's reliable data, plus proper analysis, plus professional judgment, which ultimately equals a supportable opinion of value. It's not guesswork, it is a very systematic, evidence-based process. It's absolutely crucial that we separate what is a hardcore fact from what is an opinion here. A land area of exactly 1,000 square meters or a historical completed sales price? Those are verifiable facts. You can go out and physically measure the land, or you can look at the ink on the sales contract. But a market value of 25 million pesos? That is a professional opinion. Value isn't something you can just physically observe. It's estimated. It's based on supply, demand, economic conditions, and future benefits. Because, no two properties are ever perfectly identical, establishing value requires deep, deep analysis, not just basic observation. Moving right along, let's look at Section 2, appraisers versus other professionals. We honestly confuse these roles all the time in the market, but their end goals are literally worlds apart. Just think about a real estate broker for a second. If a property owner says, hey, I want to sell my place for 50 million pesos, a broker is going to take that target, advertise the property, and try their hardest to facilitate a transaction around that exact price. They're an advocate for the deal. The appraiser, on the other hand, they act as an objective, independent analyst. They have to sit back and ask, okay, what value does the available evidence actually support? They can't just automatically rubber stamp the owner's 50 million peso dream price. Let's lock in these distinctions really quick by looking at the fundamental question that drives each of these professions. For the appraiser, the core question is, what is the property worth? For the assessor, the person working on property taxation, it's what amount or proportion of this is taxable. The broker, as we said, asks, how can a transaction be completed? And then you have the consultant, who's looking at the broader strategy, asking, what should be done with the property? Like, should we lease it, subdivide it, redevelop it? Keeping these central questions straight tells you exactly who you need in your corner for your specific real estate problem. All right, let's hit Section 3, the art and science of valuation. Before an appraiser ever even thinks about stating a value, they have to follow this incredibly rigorous 6-step process. They identify the problem, they establish the scope of work, they collect the information, and then, and this is the absolute most critical part, right at step 4, they verify it. Notice how gathering information is immediately followed by verifying it. An online asking price or some owner just giving a verbal statement, that is absolutely not treated as verified market evidence. It has to be heavily scrutinized. After that comes the market analysis and finally analyzing the highest and best use. Basically asking, is a potential use physically possible, legally permissible, financially feasible, and maximally productive? Once that groundwork is totally laid out, appraisers bring in 3 distinct mathematical approaches. First, you have the market approach, which looks at adjusted comparables. Then the cost approach, which takes the land value, adds the cost to replace the building, and subtracts depreciation. And finally, the income approach, which looks at the income the property actually generates divided by a capitalization rate. But here's the real kicker. They don't just mash the math of these 3 approaches together and average them out at the end. The final step is something called reconciliation. That requires reasoned weighting based entirely on professional judgment, depending on which approach is the most rock solid for that specific type of property. Which actually brings up a fantastic question, one that constantly confuses buyers, sellers, and honestly even seasoned investors who kind of assume valuation is just an exact science. If you take 2 highly competent, totally ethical appraisers and have them look at the exact same property, can they actually come up with 2 different numbers? The answer to that is a resounding yes. And that's because valuation is an art just as much as it's a science. two seasoned professionals might reasonably select slightly different comparable sales. They might differ on how they adjust for location or time. Just looking at the income approach, if a property generates 5 million pesos in net operating income, appraiser A might use a 10% capitalization rate, which gives you a 50 million peso valuation. But appraiser B, they might use a 9.5% rate, landing at roughly 53.6 million. And you know what? Both are perfectly supportable. A 50 million versus 53 million valuation is a totally acceptable difference of professional opinion. Now, on the flip side, if one says 50 million and the other says 150 million, yeah, that massive jump means there is a major problem with someone's data, methodology, or competence. To really wrap our heads around this, we absolutely have to define market price. Simply put, market price is just the observed transaction amount. It's the number written on the check. But just because a property sold for a certain amount doesn't mean that's its true intrinsic value. Why? Because market price is heavily influenced by wildly specific, sometimes random circumstances. Think about extreme seller urgency, or maybe terrible marketing, or a special family relationship where, say, an uncle sells a plot of land to his nephew for a massive discount.
But market value, that is in stark contrast. Market value is carefully estimated based on objective open market conditions. This is exactly why a property might have an actual selling price of 12.5 million pesos. Maybe the seller was in distress and needed cash right away, but it could have a fully supported appraised market value of 14 million. Price is basically just a historical footnote of a single interaction. Value, however, is a professional conclusion of what the property is genuinely worth in a fair, open, and competitive market. And that naturally brings us to Section 4, Navigating Ethical Pressures.
I want you to imagine this gritty, real-world scenario. A client walks up to an appraiser and says, "Look, I need this property to be worth at least 100 million pesos, because otherwise the bank is not going to approve my loan." This isn't just some innocent request. It is a massive, glaring conflict of interest. So how does an independent analyst respond to that kind of intense pressure, especially when it's coming from the very person writing their paycheck? Well, that kind of pressure creates severe ethical threats. An appraiser literally has to remain completely independent and objective. Yielding to that pressure warps the entire process into a dangerous game of confirmation bias. Instead of the proper flow of researching, analyzing, and then forming an opinion, a compromised appraiser works backwards. They start with a predetermined target value. Then, they engage in selective research, conveniently ignoring lower, more accurate transactions, and they end up manufacturing artificial justification just to hit that number. Honestly, it's straight-up misrepresentation, and it instantly destroys the credibility of the appraisal. And caving to that pressure, it is catastrophic, not just for the appraiser who might lose their license, but for the entire financial system. Because an appraisal isn't just some feel-good piece of paper for the client, it has highly specific intended users. Banks rely on these numbers for mortgage lending and managing credit risk. Government agencies need them for fair taxation and expropriation. Courts depend on them in bitter legal battles over estates. All of these massive institutions rely entirely on this uncompromised, specific evidence to make multi-million peso decisions. So, we're going to wrap up with this really profound truth that perfectly summarizes everything we talked about today. Price is observed. Value is estimated. When a client hires an appraisal, they are purchasing their professional expertise, not a predetermined, guaranteed result. And that leaves us with a pretty big question. The next time you, or a business you're involved with, makes the biggest financial transaction of your life, are you going to rely on a potentially manipulated, highly circumstantial price tag, or are you going to demand a deeply ethical, rigorously estimated professional opinion of value? Make sure you know the difference.